How reliable are, those snapshots in your mind of moments past? When you replay an event, are you seeing the raw footage, or is it something your brain is sort of pieced together? Today, we're plunging into the fascinating and, yeah, sometimes unsettling world of reconstructive memory.
That's right. We tend to trust our memories, don't we? Like they're these flawless recordings.
Hmm.
But the science, well, it suggests a much more dynamic process. We've been digging through this really thought-provoking source, a PDF actually, that uses research and some pretty stark real-world examples to show just how flexible and, frankly, fallible our memories can be.
Exactly. And our mission, really, for this deep dive is to get a handle on how easily our memories can be shaped. What are these subtle things that can nudge them one way or another, and why does it matter? In our daily lives, sure, but especially when things get serious. Okay, let's unpack this. So where does this whole idea, this reconstructive memory concept, even start?
Well, the groundwork was really laid by Bartlett. He was the one who first proposed that remembering isn't just like pulling up a stored file. It's more like actively rebuilding the memory each time you access it. And Elizabeth Loftus, she's been a huge figure in building on this. Her work really highlights how even the way questions are phrased, especially by someone in authority, can significantly influence what a witness remembers.
Right, which brings us to this thing called the misinformation effect. That sounds pretty important to understand.
Oh, it's crucial. The misinformation effect basically is how information we get after an event happens. Things like leading questions or even just suggestions picked up here and there can actually change our memory of the original event itself.
Wait, so you mean information from like the news or social media? Or even just chatting with other people who were there?
Exactly. All those sources. They can seep in and subtly alter the original memory trace.
So even if I'm totally confident about what I saw, and I tell someone, and then they share their take, maybe with a slightly different detail, that could actually change what I think I remember seeing.
Precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit concerning. People can become absolutely convinced of these reconstructed memories, utterly confident, even when they're not accurate.
How does that happen?
Well, our brains are constantly trying to make sense of things, right? They fill in the blanks, often without us even realizing it. They use whatever's available, our past experiences, general knowledge, maybe even stereotypes.
Huh. So it's like patching the holes in the memory.
Kind of, yeah. And when these tweaked eyewitness accounts filled with these patches are taken as fact, well, the consequences can be truly damaging, especially in, say, a legal context.
And the source we looked at, the PDF, it really drives this home with the story of Ronald Cotton.
Oh, it's a powerful and honestly a gut-wrenching example of exactly what we're talking about. It really is. Ronald Cotton was wrongly convicted of rape back in 1984. He spent 11 long years in prison, and the conviction was based almost entirely on the eyewitness testimony of the victim, Jennifer Thompson.
11 years.
Yeah. It wasn't until 1995, when DNA evidence finally came into play, that he was exonerated, cleared completely.
11 years.
Yeah.
Based on someone's memory. That really makes you stop and think. The PDF asks this really direct question. I think it's central for us. How is it possible that Jennifer Thompson got it wrong? What jumps out at you there?
Well, as the source points out, this very case, this tragic error, became a major inspiration for a lot of Loftus's later research into leading questions and memory distortion. It really highlights how subtle suggestions, maybe during the initial police questioning or during the photo lineup, how those things can, over time, reshape someone's memory in really profound ways, leading to these terrible miscarriages of justice.
So it wasn't necessarily just a simple mistake in remembering, like forgetting a detail, but potentially a memory that was actually twisted or altered by the process itself, by how she was questioned.
That's a core idea in reconstructive memory theory, yeah. Our brains aren't like perfect video recorders. They're constantly updating, integrating new information, sometimes even overwriting bits of the original. And to explore this mechanism, the PDF discusses a really famous study by Loftus and Palmer from, way back in 1974.
The car crash experiments.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think I remember hearing about these. What exactly were they trying to figure out?
So their main aim was pretty specific. They wanted to see if just changing the verb used to describe a car accident would affect how fast eyewitnesses estimated the cars were going.
Right, they showed people videos.
Yeah, 45 students split into groups. They all watched these short clips of car accidents. Then they had to answer questionnaires. One key question was about speed.
And they just tweaked one word in that speed question for each group.
Oh, exactly. That was the clever bit. For different groups, they asked about how fast were the cars going and then they used different verbs. Hit, collided, bumped, smashed, or contacted.
And did it make a difference?
Oh, absolutely. The results were pretty striking. The group that got the word smashed, they estimated a significantly higher speed, on average about 41 miles per hour.
Wow.
Compare that to the group that got the word contacted. Their average estimate was only around 32 miles per hour.
So almost a 10-mile-per-hour difference just based on that one word, smashed versus contacted.
Yeah. Think about that. Just changing that one verb seemed to implant a sense of greater force, a more violent impact, which then altered their memory or at least their judgment of the speed.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It really shows how the language we use, even subtly, can shape how we perceive and remember an event, even right after seeing it.
It really does. And they didn't stop there. In a follow-up experiment, they pushed it further. They wanted to see if this linguistic nudge could even affect recalling details that weren't actually there at all.
How do they test that?
So they got a new group of 150 students, showed them a film, a multiple car accident. Then they asked some of them the speed question using smashed, some using hit. And a control group wasn't asked about speed at all. A week later, they brought them back and asked a critical question. Did you see any broken glass? Now, importantly, there was no broken glass in the film clip.
Okay, so what happened?
Those who had originally been asked the speed question with the word smashed were more than twice as likely to incorrectly report seeing broken glass compared to those who'd been asked with hit or the control group.
Whoa, okay, that's fascinating. And yeah, a little unsettling. So the leading question didn't just influence the speed guess. It actually seemed to plant a false memory, something that just wasn't there.
That's certainly Loftus's interpretation. She proposed that these different verbs activate different schemas. A schema is like a mental framework or blueprint you have for certain events, right?
Like a script in your head for car crash.
Exactly. So if you hear the word smashed, your car crash schema, the one that gets activated, probably includes images of higher speeds, more damage, maybe broken glass, and that schema influences how you reconstruct the memory, potentially leading you to remember details that fit the schema, even if they weren't actually present.
But, okay, the source material also points out some issues with this study, right? I mean, it was done in a lab,
Yeah.
watching videos. That's not quite the same as witnessing a real crash.
Absolutely, that's a key limitation. The controlled lab setting, while good for isolating variables, might lack what researchers call ecological validity. Basically, it might not perfectly mirror how memory works out there in the messy real world, with real stress and emotions involved.
Yeah, people watching a video probably aren't feeling the same kind of shock or fear.
Probably not. And the questions were also quite specific, sort of closed questions, which limits how people could respond. Plus, the participants were all students, maybe not representative of everyone. And as the PDF rightly asks, let's be honest, how good are most of us at accurately guessing the speed of a car, even if we see it happen? That skill itself is pretty variable.
Right, that's a really good point. So while Loftus and Palmer's work gave us these powerful insights into suggestibility, we need to keep those limitations in mind. And that, I guess, is where other research comes in, like the study by Yule and Kutschall mentioned in the PDF, offering a different angle.
Exactly. Yule and Kutschall decided to look at this very question, the effect of leading questions, but in a real-world, high-stakes situation. They studied a shooting incident that happened at a gun shop in Vancouver.
A real crime scene.
Yeah. They interviewed 13 eyewitnesses who had actually been there during the shooting, but they did these interviews about 4 months after the event. And crucially, they deliberately included some leading questions in their interviews.
Similar to Loftus and Palmer, like suggesting details that weren't true.
Kind of. They asked about things like a broken headlight on the getaway car. There wasn't one. Or about a specific panel on the car being yellow when it was actually blue. Things designed to mislead, based on Loftus's findings.
Okay, so what did they find? Did the leading questions mess up the witnesses' memories in this real traumatic situation?
Well, here's the twist. They found, quite strikingly, that the eyewitnesses were remarkably reliable. They recalled a large volume of accurate details about the event.
Really? Even 4 months later?
Even 4 months later. And these details lined up incredibly well with the original police reports taken right after the crime. What's even more interesting is that they weren't significantly swayed by those misleading questions about the headlight or the car color.
Huh. So the misinformation effect didn't seem nearly as strong here.
It didn't seem to take hold in the same way. And they also found something else quite intriguing. The witnesses who reported experiencing more stress during the actual event tended to have more accurate memories later on, not less.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty big contrast to the implications of the Loftus and Palmer lab studies. What do you think explains that difference? Why were these witnesses seemingly more resistant?
Well, the key difference, as the PDF really emphasizes, is the setting, the ecological validity. You and Cutshall studied a real event with real danger, real emotions.
Not just watching a film clip.
Exactly. These were people who had a genuine visceral experience. That emotional component, that sense of real consequence, might actually help to solidify certain aspects of memory, making them more resistant to later suggestion. Plus, they had external evidence, the police records, to check the accuracy against,
Right, the archival evidence.
which you don't have in the same way in a lab study creating artificial scenarios. The intense emotional response in a real crisis might play a significant role in how those memories are encoded and how resistant they are to being overwritten.
But the PDF also notes that the Yule and Cutshall study had its own limitations too, yeah? It wasn't a controlled experiment you could easily replicate.
That's definitely true. It was a one-off event, a field study. You can't rerun a real-life shooting under controlled conditions. So it's harder to generalize the findings universally. And they also couldn't control what happened in those 4 months between the event and their interviews. Did the witnesses talk to each other? Did they rehearse the memory in their minds? That's hard to know.
Right, so it raises this interesting question, doesn't it? Maybe different types of memories or memories formed under different conditions have different levels of reliability or vulnerability.
Exactly. And the source briefly touches on this idea, mentioning cases like HM, the famous patient who lost the ability to form new conscious memories after surgery, but could still learn new physical skills like procedural memory. It shows memory isn't just one single system. Perhaps the memory for the core emotional gist of a traumatic event, like in Yule and Cutshall, is processed or stored differently, maybe more robustly, than the memory for peripheral details that might be more susceptible to suggestion, like the speed estimates in Loftus's study.
Which then leads us to another fascinating piece of research mentioned in the PDF, the Bartlett study on yearbooks. This one looked at memory over a much, much longer timescale.
Yes, the Bartlett et al. Study from 1975. This one was all about autobiographical memory, specifically how well people remember the names and faces of their high school classmates over decades.
So not about a single event, but about accumulated knowledge over time.
Right. They tested nearly 400 people, aged from 17 up to 74. These people had graduated high school anywhere from very recently to almost 60 years prior. The key was they needed access to their old yearbooks.
And they used different kinds of tests, didn't they, to see how well people remembered?
They did 5 different tests. There was free recall, just trying to list names they remembered, then photo recognition, picking classmates from a set of pictures, name recognition, a matching task linking names to photos, and picture cueing seeing a photo and recalling the name.
So testing memory in various ways, what did they find? How well did these memories hold up over potentially half a century?
The findings were really quite revealing. For recognition tasks like picking out faces or names, people were remarkably accurate, especially within the first 15 years after graduation. Around 90% accuracy.
That's really high.
It is. And even after almost 50 years, recognition was still pretty good, about 80% accuracy for names and 70% for faces. But free recall, just trying to pull names out of thin air, that was much, much harder and declined way more significantly over time.
Ah, okay. So being able to recognize something you've seen before, like a face, seems much more durable than having to actively retrieve that information, like a name without a cue.
Exactly that. Recognition memory seems remarkably robust over long periods. Now, the PDF notes this was a cross-sectional study. They looked at different people at different stages after graduation, not the same people over time. So you can't completely rule out differences between the groups themselves.
Right. Maybe people graduating in the 1920s had different experiences or memory skills than those graduating in the 70s.
Potentially. But the sheer number of participants, nearly 400, does suggest a pretty strong general trend. Our ability to recognize faces, in particular, holds up surprisingly well over incredibly long periods.
Okay. So we've got these different strands now. We have Loftus showing how suggestion can really warp memory, especially in controlled settings. Then we have Ewell and Cutshall suggesting that real-world emotional memories might be tougher, more resistant, and Barrick showing that some types of memory, like recognition, are just incredibly long-lasting. How do we synthesize all this? It seems a bit contradictory in places.
Yeah, it might seem that way at first glance, but what's truly fascinating, I think, is how these findings together paint a much richer, more nuanced picture of memory. It's not an all or nothing thing. Loftus's work is crucial because it powerfully demonstrates the malleability of memory, how susceptible it can be to post-event information, especially in less emotional, more controlled contexts.
Mm.
It highlights the reconstructive nature, but Yulin Kutschel's research reminds us that ecological validity matters. When memories are forged in the heat of real, personally significant emotional events, they can be surprisingly robust and resistant to distortion, especially concerning the core details. Emotion might act as a kind of anchor, perhaps.
Okay. And Barak?
Barak adds another vital layer. It shows us that memory isn't monolithic. Different types of information are remembered differently. Recognizing a face relies on different processes and seems much less prone to decay than trying to freely recall a name. Different memory systems, different levels of reliability over time.
Right. So the big takeaway isn't simply memory is unreliable or memory is reliable. It's much more complex.
Yeah.
It's this active process of building and rebuilding. It is vulnerable to influence, definitely, but it's also capable of holding on to certain kinds of information incredibly well, especially when tied to real experiences or strong cues like faces.
Precisely. Memory is an act of reconstruction. It's shaped by our existing knowledge, schemas, stereotypes. It's shaped by new information we encounter after the event, and very much by how we are questioned about the past. But as that real-world crime scene study suggested, the emotional weight and the specific context of the original event also play a huge role in the accuracy and staying power of those memories. And, like the yearbook study showed, some types of recall, particularly recognition, just seem to have a much longer shelf life.
So for you listening, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How this understanding of memory might play out in your own life.
Yeah.
Think about how you recall past conversations, maybe arguments, how you interpret news reports, especially those relying on eyewitness accounts, even how you think about the justice system itself.
Yeah, and it raises this really important, maybe slightly uncomfortable question for all of us. Given how easily our memories can be influenced, how easily they can shift without us even knowing, how can we become maybe more critical consumers of information and perhaps more mindful, more careful about the way we recall and recount our own past? It's definitely something to keep thinking about, for our own understanding and for how we navigate the information swirling around us every day.